Okay, there we go. We're back. Another workout, another video. Yay. We're going to talk today a little bit about the Golden Age of Athens and the end of that, and then the Hellenistic period. So, okay, last video, we talked about classical Greece in the post-Dark Ages era, post-Greek Dark Age. I don't want to get you confused with the European Dark Ages that happened after the fall of Rome. That's a whole other thing. We'll get to that in time. Okay, so the Persian War is over by about 450 BCE, mid-5th century BCE. Athens comes out smelling relatively like a rose in this one, having masterminded the Delian League and the whole pan-Hellenism strategy that united the cities of Greece, the Polein of Greece, in resistance to the Persian Empire, and successfully held them off. Biggest empire the world had ever known up to that point, probably. And the tiny backwater of Greece, backwater of the world, Greece, had successfully repelled their invasion. People were intrigued. Athens, in particular, quickly became a sort of cultural, intellectual, economic powerhouse in the aftermath of this event, as you might expect. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of the details here. There's stuff in your book on this. There's other videos that I can link and give you some good resources for that, or Greek drama and things like that. Honestly, videos like that would have higher production values. Videos that would be useful for that would have higher production values than mine. So I'm going to kind of refer you to other people. I talk about this stuff in class, but I don't have all of the resources I normally have. I don't have my whiteboard. I don't have other stuff. And I'm trying to produce these videos as quickly as possible right now. I'm trying to just get the content up so that you guys can interact with it. And that means not spending, as much as I enjoy doing the editing, right now that means not spending all day trying to get one 45, 50-minute video ready for consumption. And that's what it would take. This way I can just record the thing, slam it up on YouTube, and you've got the lecture. I may revisit at some point, record some different videos that I have time to sit down and do editing on. I don't know. It won't be for this class. Maybe in the future. Anyway. Athens was enjoying particularly privileged social status. Now, one of those in the world, in the classical world. And so, as happens when a particular society comes to prominence, cultural prominence, its ideas and its cultural practices and things like that begin to become exported at least a little bit. Athens was the home of philosophy at this point. Now, I've talked a bit in a past video, I believe, about the mythological versus the rational worldview. If I haven't, I'm positive I've talked about this in a video. I'll try and find it and link to it for you. But the post-Persian War Athenian culture, with its democracy and its high levels of sophistication in art and commerce and law, it only makes sense that philosophy, this sort of rational exploration of the world, was going to come to prominence there. That they would be the first guy at the gate in this part of the world for a certain disciplined way of going about answering questions that had previously been answered in a more aesthetic mode. How were the questions of what is the world like, and stop that. Sorry. How were the questions of why does the sun come up? Why do we get sick? Why does it rain? Why does it not rain when I need it to rain? So on and so forth. These questions were previously answered by religion, by their complex mythologies of how the world was structured, and the idea of, and these complex mythologies positioned the world as being run by gods and monsters, powerful beings far beyond humanity that could ensure that things happened the way they happened. And humans, if they wanted something to happen, just kind of had to suck up to the gods and monsters and hope for the best. The ultimate rationale of these mythologies was an aesthetic rationale. It was the logic of narrative, story. Philosophy displaces that with a different logic, a kind of rational logic, a sense of causes and effects, and that the world exists and it just exists as it is, and maybe there are gods and spirits out there, but maybe not. And certainly humans, rather than being at the mercy of gods and monsters who run the world, humans can know and control their world, that they can begin to explore it in this rational fashion and come up with answers. Why does it rain? Well, it's no longer sufficient to just say, oh, because the sky god wanted it to rain. The philosophers were looking for, I guess you could say, mechanistic explanations. What are the series of causes and effects? What is everything made of? What are the operating principles of the universe? So, this mindset, the mindset of philosophy, and the mindset that permeates Greek art in this period, is fundamentally humanism. Now, humanism is a word you're going to get sick of hearing me say. I'm going to say it until you wake up in the middle of the night. Humanism! Right? I'm going to say it over and over again. Humanism, humanism. Humanism is simply the idea that humans are important and they can know and control their universe. Humanism centers humanity in our ontological view, in our sense of how everything is connected and how it all works. Humans are center stage rather than being minor players who have to suck up to gods and monsters to get anything done. This humanistic revolution in classical Greece would be I mean, I can't really oversell it. It's a paradigm shift in the early world because it's so very different from what was going on elsewhere. It is so very distinct. And we live in a humanistic world. Humanism is not necessarily incompatible with religion. Some of the great humanist writers in the Renaissance, say, High Middle Ages and Renaissance in Europe, were Christian humanists. And they were convinced that because the Christian God created humans, that he deemed them to be especially important. And he put them on earth, and sort of everything revolves around humanity. I mean, in their theology, it makes a lot of sense, because the whole of the universe is designed, in the Christian humanist theology, the whole of the universe is designed to support this mechanism of redemption and salvation. Everything is, literally everything in existence here on earth and beyond that is designed around this logic of this concern for what happens to humanity, what happens to the souls of humans. And that's a very humanist viewpoint. These Christian humanists were convinced that humans were important, and that as a sort of derived fact from that initial assumption, that they could know and control their world, that God would not have plopped them down in a world that was just confusing and obscure and impenetrable to them. So they encouraged learning. They encouraged the exercise of reason. This is a Christian humanist worldview. Now, obviously, the classical Greeks living, 400 some odd years before the supposed ministries of Jesus are not Christian humanists, but they are humanists. That is their culture, generally speaking. You can see it in their art, as well as in their philosophy and in their social organization. The concept of rule of law is a humanist concept, which places humans on a sort of equal footing before the law. That they are not subject to the arbitrary whims of a despot, of an autocrat. They are instead subject to laws made by their fellow humans. That they all came together and agreed this is how we should be ruled. This is so important. The demos, the crowd, the general population was not regarded to be, divine in any way or connected to the gods in the same way that the priest kings, the autocrats of the East were. The autocrats of Mesopotamian society ruled because they were, buddied up with the gods and monsters who actually ran things. In other words, the gods and monsters really run the world, and this guy, who isn't a god or a monster, only gets to run everything in our society because he's got their phone number. Or if you're in Egypt, because you think he is literally descended from the gods and monsters. Okay. So this is different. Nobody thought that the citizens of Athens were all descendants of the gods and monsters. That's not what gave them the authority to rule. What gave them the authority to rule was simply the idea that, hey, we should govern ourselves. We know best how to take care of ourselves. We'll get together, we'll make a few decisions, we'll pass some laws, everybody will be subject to that. And maybe the laws will change at some point in the future if we feel like it. Not if the gods feel like it, not if the monsters feel like it, but if we, humans, feel like it. Rule of law, a humanistic social institution. Philosophy, we can investigate in a disciplined, rational fashion why the world is the way it is. And maybe those causes and effects fit together neatly and have a pleasant aesthetic sort of resonance to them, or maybe they don't, right? Maybe the truth is unaesthetic and does not make for a good story, does not make for a good myth. So what? The truth is the truth. And we, as humans, can know about it. We can figure it out. The world is not eternally obscure to us. It is something that we can comprehend and maybe even control. Philosophy, a humanistic discipline, a humanistic conception of how to relate to the world. Their art, the sculptures of the great realistic sculptures, the ones who brought realism in, rather than the abstract, figurative characters that you find in Egypt or ancient Sumeria or something like that. The Tel Asmar figures, those are not particularly form accurate for humans. They're vaguely human looking, and that's about it. And the early Greek, the stuff right after the Greek Dark Age is a little more abstract. But then you get into the the Golden Age of Athens, and especially as seen in the sculptures of Phidias, the greatest Athenian sculptor, arguably. I usually show slides of this in class. I'll have to put links to some stuff. But as you see these sculptures where the primary concern, obviously, was to represent the human form in the most realistic way possible, why would they bother? Why would they do that? Why would they care so much about representing the human form unless the human form was of particular importance, unless the human form was a standard of beauty, right? That is a humanistic paradigm of art making, to center the human experience. The Tel Asmar figures look the way they did because the experience being centered was the experience of the gods. Remember, the Tel Asmar figures stand in these awkward poses of supplication, and their eyes are big, not because people's eyes were bigger in ancient Sumeria, but because the people who made them wanted the gods to get a sense of reverence from these figures, right? The figures on the standard of Ur are not in proportion to each other in realistic human ways. They are in proportion to how significant they are to the gods, right? Priests and priest kings are bigger, and lowly peasants, enemies of the city and therefore enemies of the city's gods, are small. The hieratic scale, as discussed in the book, the hieratic scale reflects that the point of view, that the ideal viewer for these artworks is not a human. The ideal viewer for these artworks is something else, a god, who will see this and recognize, the relative importance of these characters. That is not humanistic. It does not center the human experience. The realistic artworks, the artworks that attempt to portray human life in a relatable and realistic fashion, center the human experience. They say, what will appeal to, what will speak to, what will reach humans, not the gods, humans. Even though even though probably all of the early Athenian art starts with its religious components, it evolves beyond that. The Athenian theater, or Greek theater in general, starts off as celebrations to Dionysus. It starts off as these ritual affairs, but it evolves quickly beyond that until we get to the point where Aristotle, writing in the Poetics, his discourse on drama, Aristotle, writing in the Poetics, is telling us that the object of the tragedy, the Greek tragedy, as a form of drama, is to evoke fear and pity from the audience, right? It is to reach the emotions of the audience. That is a vastly different goal than a ritual enactment that is meant to get the attention of the gods, right? That is a humanistic approach to drama that is centering the experience of humans in the art, rather than centering the experience of gods and monsters. I could go on and on and on, but the upshot is, in the golden age of Athens, their culture, and therefore, to some extent, Greek culture at large, since they were the culture leaders of the Greek world, their culture was suffused with this idea of humanism. Humans matter and can know and control their world. Humans are at the center of their thinking in terms of how to organize society, how to make art, how to go about investigating and understanding the operation of their world, so on and so forth. Okay, so humanism is the watchword here. And we live in a humanistic world, generally speaking. There are always some people who think that the world is fundamentally unknowable to us. They don't trust science. They don't put great stock in learning. They're more interested in sucking up to the gods and or monsters that they think runs everything. That's the only way to really get anything done. Fine. But generally speaking, as a culture, Western society, world society mostly, but Western society in particular, is humanistic, right? We just assume that over the course of time, humans are going to continue to make breakthroughs and figure things out. Like, not long ago, I read that there was a vaccine for type 2 diabetes. I think it's type 2 diabetes. But they had developed a vaccine for type 2 diabetes. That's batshit, man, when you think about it. That's crazy progress. And it would have been especially nuts to the non-humanistic early Mesopotamians, right? If you went to an early Mesopotamian and said, oh, wow, everyone's dying of disease, and they go, yeah. And I said, well, what have you done about it? And they said, well, we tried praying to, Ereshkigal, but I guess she didn't care. And I would say, well, do you think you'll ever cure this disease? That would have literally made no sense to them. First of all, it's not up to them whether the disease goes away. And second of all, how would humans do that? This disease is part of the natural order of the world, right? It is a part of how things operate as mandated by the gods and monsters who run the world. And it's not up to humans whether the disease stays or goes. It's up to the gods. We don't think that way. On a very fundamental level, our assumptions are humanistic. That, if I say in 50 years, do you think you'll have a cure for, whatever, and I name some disease, you're like, yeah, maybe. To even entertain that as a possibility is a humanistic assumption. It's an assumption that humans can make that kind of progress in the world, can exert control over their world and its natural features. And that's something that is not present in this ahumanistic or non-humanistic mindset. So, the humanism of the classical Greeks was unique in that era, in that time and place. It was a deeply unusual way of looking at the world. And yet today, it is just how we see things. It's just how it is. The story of how we get from A to B there is a story that involves a person named Alexander the Great. Okay, now there are some videos online that talk about Alexander the Great, and they tend to talk extensively about his military victories. You may have heard of him in the context of being some famous conqueror, but you may not know much more than that, and that's fine. I don't think that's the most interesting part of Alexander the Great. I get frustrated at history videos that get... I get frustrated at historical videos that fail to explain the forest in favor of enumerating the trees. Yes, Alexander did this thing at this time, and then this thing at this time, and then this thing at this time. What does it mean? Well, what is the significance of that? What's the larger story? I don't like that. I think it's a shallow way to do history. It's fine. You have to start somewhere. But there's so much more on the plate. Anyway. Alexander the Great's story is intimately connected with the story of philosophy in classical Greece. The great philosophers in classical Greece, and classical Athens in particular, started laying out their ideas about how the world worked and so on and so forth. They began with, some would argue, Socrates. There are pre-Socratic philosophers. We don't know much about them. Their work survives only in fragments. Socrates didn't write anything down, but his student Plato wrote a lot about Socrates, and then wrote stuff later in life that was more his own stuff. At first, he was just sort of rehashing his teacher's ideas, and then he sort of developed his own ideas. But the point being, after Plato comes Aristotle, who was, very well-regarded, highly learned philosopher. And as such, he was hired as the private tutor to the son of a king, Philip of Macedon. Now, if Greece is a nowheresville backwater of the classical world, which is to say Muskogee, if Greece is the Muskogee of the classical world, Macedon is like the shitty part of Muskogee, right? Macedon's like the sketchy part on the outside of town. Macedon is the backwater of the backwater. But Philip had a lot of money and not much in the way of social prestige, being where he was from. And so he, direct ordered tutors from the cultural capital of the world, Aristotle being maybe the most famous among them, but not the only one. He direct ordered tutors to come and teach his son all of the, the hip shit going on in the city, so that Alexander, when he took over, would get a little more respect than Philip of Macedon did. Now, it comes that Philip of Macedon dies, and Alexander is still relatively young. I don't remember his exact age. I think it's about 18. Your book will probably tell you. Philip of Macedon dies. Alexander inherits the kingdom. And maybe Philip's plan to have Alexander tutored by philosophers backfired or front-fired? I don't know, because it both worked and didn't work. Hard to say. Here's the thing. Alexander was not content to simply take the posh education that he had gotten and, bring a little more respectability to his neck of the woods. Oh, no. Alexander had gotten an idea, not from Aristotle, who vehemently opposed this idea, but from another scholar that was hired to teach him, whose name escapes me. His name begins with an I, but I can't remember anything further than that. Anyway, Aristotle had Alexander had latched on to this idea of homonoia. 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 The unity of all men, or I mean, it's a very chauvinist way of saying the unity of all people, but literally translated, the unity of all. The unity of all men. The unity of all people. What did that mean? Well, remember Pan-Hellenism? Okay. The idea that the Greeks have a distinct and special culture that is worth defending against outside cultures, against outsiders, against others. Okay. Homonoia was this idea that at their root, all people, in their essence, all people who live in separate nations and worship separate gods and so on and so forth, all people have a natural inclination to be one, that they should be one, that they should be together. And that it is only because they are taught differently, that they grow up in different places, worshiping different gods and different values and things like that. That's the only thing that separates them. That's the cause of strife and warfare. Sounds like a lovely utopian peaceful idea, right? Not the kind of thing that you would use, to make war. It's the kind of thing you would use to try to stop wars. But Alexander also was influenced by the successes of Pan-Hellenism, okay? And he had a grudge against the Persians. Because you see, by the time Alexander came around and got his kingdom, the Persians had come back. The empire strikes back. It was a sequel. And the best part is, the Spartans helped them. The Spartans who fought the Persians the first time, basically because they hated the Athenians more, were willing to cooperate with the Persians the second time around. And yeah, that was pretty much that. Greece could not get lucky twice in a row. And the Persians rolled in and installed governors and kind of became foreign rulers of Greece. Now, ironically enough, this didn't change day-to-day life in Greece that much, except that now neither Athens nor Sparta was particularly great shakes in any way. Both of them had suffered the devastation of the Second War, the Peloponnesian War. Both of them were laid pretty low by now. So, what Alexander grew up with was this. He grew up believing firmly in Pan-Hellenism, that Greek culture is special and distinct and super awesome. He was taught Greek culture by the best, brightest, most prominent philosophers of his day. So of course he believed that. He grew up knowing that the Greeks unified were able to throw off the Persians, and when they didn't stand together, the Persians came back and beat them and humbled that Greek culture that he loved and cared about so much. Was it Iamblichus? No. Anyway, it starts with an I. Anyway, and he was also taught and believed that if humans only had a common culture, they would not make war on each other. Well, 3 guesses as to which culture he thought should be that common culture, and the first 2 don't count. Obviously, Greek culture, right? Greek culture is special and should be defended, and it's distinctive, and it's awesome. It's awesome. Right? Greek culture is awesome. Greek culture is the best. It's the shiz. It's the bee's knees. And if all people had the same culture, Greek culture, as far as Alexander was concerned, there would be no more fighting. It would all be peaceful. And he said, hell yes, let's do that. And holy crap, he did. He took the armies that he inherited, and also, his grudge against the Persians, because they messed with Greek culture. He conquered everything, right? I mean, it's just such a weird It's a weird lineage. Socrates, a philosopher, teaches Plato, a philosopher. Plato teaches Aristotle, a philosopher. Aristotle teaches Alexander, who is Dr. Doom, right? He's a supervillain. He's trying to conquer the world in the name of philosophy. What the poop? Who even does that? But he did it. He was brilliant. A brilliant soldier and a brilliant general. Possibly got some advantages on his side because the Persians were a bit overextended. I mean, maybe in different circumstances, his conquest would have gone a little rougher. I don't know. But he moves... He unifies the Greek world, throwing off Persian rule there, moves eastward to the Anatolian Peninsula, and then just rolls like a steamroller across the known world, south into Syria and Palestine and Israel, and even into Egypt, of all places, which doesn't get conquered by outsiders, really. Rolls into Egypt, conquers Egypt, rolls westward across the Fertile Crescent and into the Persian Plateau, conquers, destroys the Persian Empire, the biggest empire the world had ever known up to that point, lays waste to it, and then pushes further east, all the way into India, reaches the outskirts of India before he turns back. Alexander had conquered everything in the name of philosophy, in the name of uniting the world. And thus, when he conquered everything, he wasn't just in it for the gold, he was in it to spread that unique, wonderful Greek culture, or so he thought, the Greek culture that he so very loved, and the Greek culture that Athens had pumped everybody up about defending in Pan-Hellenism, right? So you can kind of see, right, if it hadn't been for this Pan-Hellenism idea that Athens cooked up, maybe Alexander wouldn't have done any of this. I don't know. But certainly it played a factor in his thinking. Alexander spreads Greek culture everywhere he goes. He spreads copies of the great works of Greek literature, the great works of Greek art. He tries to teach the locals to do things the Greek way. They were mostly allowed to go about their own religions and so on and so forth. He just wanted to put Greek culture in front of them because he thought it was naturally superior. Then he croaks at the age of 33, possibly from the STD, possibly from drinking too much. Maybe he was poisoned. It's not a good look, in any case. He dies at the age of 33, and his empire basically collapses. Administratively, it was a mess. All of his top people, all of his top generals fight for the succession. Who's going to be the next Alexander? And politically speaking, this means that there's no one large unifying empire in this region anymore. It's just a bunch of separate little realms run by generals who used to serve Alexander, who are now fighting with each other, despite their common Greek culture. Oh, Alexander, you silly goose. Right? Anyway, despite their common Greek culture, they were fighting. Explain that! So, politically speaking, what Alexander accomplished was not that interesting. He broke up a large empire that dominated the region politically and replaced it with a bunch of relatively ineffectual empires that couldn't accomplish much because they were busy fighting each other all the time. Culturally speaking, however, what he accomplished was nothing short of stunning and would have repercussions that ripple down to the present day, 2,000 years later. Now, this is all, by the way, in the 4th century BCE. Call it around 330 or so. mid to midish late 4th century BCE, the 300s, around 330-ish. I don't mean PM, I mean BCE. Okay, so why? Why was this so important culturally speaking? Well, because humanism, as I said earlier in the video, look how good at this I am. Look how good at this I am. Humanism, as I said earlier in the video, was not the dominant way of thinking pretty much anywhere except Greece at that time. We were starting to see elements of humanism creeping into the Persian way of thought, because they were still ruled by an autocrat. We were starting to see elements of humanism creeping into Egyptian art, but they were still ruled by an autocrat. What we see, though, is maybe those cultures would have transformed more fully on their own given time. But Alexander gives them, I guess you can say, an intravenous injection of humanism, whether they wanted it or not. Here, have some humanism. No, thank you. I'm sorry. I have a spear. I meant to tell you that part. Have some humanism. Oh, thank you. Yes, I'll have some humanism. Alexander gives them a main line of humanism and Greek culture. And Greek learning and the Greek language become widespread. Greek art begins to influence the art all over the place. You can draw a clear line in art in India from before Alexander showed up and after it, how the sculptural art changed. It's just fascinating, the hybridization of Greek realism in sculpture with traditional Indian forms. It's just fascinating. It's beautiful. Greek learning was everywhere after that. And their basic way of approaching the universe as if humans mattered and could know and control their universe. That they used philosophy and maybe different forms of government and their forms of art. All these things were now commonplace in places where they had never been before. And this will be crucial because at the same time, a little further west, which means if Greece is the backwater, Greece is Muskogee, and Macedon, where Philip was king and then Alexander was king afterwards, and Macedon is the sketchy part of Muskogee. A little further west of there, on what we now call Italy, a little city named Rome is starting to expand outward and take over the whole peninsula of Italy. And Rome, if Greece is Muskogee and Macedon is the backwater part of Muskogee, the sketchy trailer park on the edge of Muskogee, Rome is like the one broken down trailer that sits 5 miles out of town in a field, and there's like a bear chained up in the front yard or something. Rome is nowhere. It is nowhere. You are lost in the friggin' woods. But Rome is expanding slowly and taking over its neighbors. And when Rome begins to push outside of the peninsula of Italy, everywhere it looks, it's going to find people more culturally sophisticated, with more higher learning, with better art, with a more well-developed theology, with more robust forms of, with more textured and interesting forms of government and law and economics and so on and so forth. And everywhere it looks, when it finds that stuff, those people are going to be speaking Greek, right? Greek would be the language of knowledge and the language of learning. And because the Romans never met an idea that they didn't steal, Romans were not proud in that regard, right? The Romans, if the Romans saw somebody else doing something better than them, they're like, cool, let's do it that way. I kind of admire that about the Romans. They're immensely practical people. They were very good at building things and scabbing things. And if a problem could not be solved by either building something or stabbing something, they were kind of like, leave it to the Greek guys that we imported. They'll figure it out. Right? They were very, very focused on concrete results. Concrete! That's a joke you don't get yet. Shit. I'll link that video. Roman concrete. Concrete results. Roman concrete. Screw it. You'll think it's funny later. Anyway. But the Romans, as they begin to push out of Italy, will not only encounter Greek culture pretty much everywhere, because Alexander smeared it all over the walls like a toddler finger painting, but also they won't encounter any serious resistance, because Alexander smashed all of the big empires and then promptly died without establishing a politically stable empire of his own. In a very real way, Rome owes its success to what a devastatingly bad politician Alexander was. Because if he'd been better, then when Rome began to push beyond the borders of Italy, he would have encountered an enormous, very powerful, very stable, and unified empire. Politically centered, culturally centered, and capable of snuffing Rome out like a bug. That's what would have happened. But it didn't happen, because everywhere else was basically in chaos. Rome had taken care of the only other real competitor on the block, or was in the process of taking care of the only other real competitor on the block, Carthage in North Africa, at this point. And in the coming years, Rome will push into mainland Greece. And this is a place that just 300 or so years prior had thrown off the advances of the biggest empire in the world. And the Romans, who have Italy, which isn't that big, will be able to conquer mainland Greece. Because instead of being united under the banner of Hellenism and the leadership of the Athenians via the League of Delos, the Greeks will be disunited. They will be disorganized. They will be in chaos. They will have no political will to fend off the invading Romans. And that's all down to Alexander, right? Alexander built up this huge thing and then died, and it collapsed because he didn't have any idea how to maintain it, and neither did anyone else. So, what do we get from all this? Well, first of all, Hellenic Greek culture was spread throughout the entire classical world, even as far as India, for God's sakes, and into Egypt, which never gets conquered by outsiders, by Alexander. And then Alexander dies. And the world that's left afterward is referred to as the Hellenistic world. In other words, it's not Greek, it's not Hellenic, it's Greek-like, it's Hellenistic, right? It is Greek-ish, Greek-esque, Greeky. It is Hellenistic. It is Greek-like, because the Greek culture that was promulgated by Alexander is absorbed and syncretized with the local cultures. Like I said, in India, their sculptural art does not just completely abandon classical Indian forms. It doesn't just suddenly become Greek. It becomes a mixture of the two, the traditional Indian forms and then Greek details and Greek techniques. And that happened all over the place. Greek culture becomes assimilated into the local cultures of the entire classical world. So that when Rome finally breaks out of Italy, after defeating the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars, when Rome finally breaks out of Italy, the world that it encounters everywhere is Greek. Every bit of important learning is written in Greek. Every bit of great art is done in the Greek style, at least a little bit. It's all Greek to me. I'm hilarious, damn it. Anyway, it's all Greek. And they will straight up copy this Greek shit and incorporate it into their society. It will inform Roman society at all levels. The Romans had already developed a humanistic or more humanistic form of government on their own, the Republic, which we'll talk about when we get to Rome. But Greek philosophy, Greek mathematics, Greek ideas on the role of the citizen in the city, on art, on everything, is going to influence Roman thinking to the extent that Romans thought about anything. But it's going to influence Roman thinking. And the Romans, of course, spoilers for something that happened thousands of years ago, spoilers, the Romans will go on to conquer an even bigger area than Alexander did, a bigger area than the Persians did, really. Maybe about the same size. It will go on to conquer a huge area, including big swaths of Europe, all the way up into England, bringing Roman culture, and therefore Greek culture, to these areas. And then when the Roman Empire collapses, after quite a good run, much longer than we've had, let's face it, and we're already on the ropes. When the Roman Empire collapses, it will leave behind a tradition of ideas about how to do art, about how to live in society, about how to make laws, about how to think about the world you live in and your place in it, that is deeply, deeply steeped in Greek thought. It will leave behind a massive tradition of Greek culture. So sort of just in the same way that Alexander spreads Greek culture east and south and all over the classical world, the Romans will smear Greek culture all over the untamed lands of Europe. And when new societies bloom out of the ruins of the Roman Empire in Europe, the soil that nourishes them will be Roman and Greek. And we still owe a lot of our institutions and cultural ideas and practices to the Greeks and the Romans. I mean, look at a lot of government buildings, not all of them, but look at the great government buildings, especially in Washington, D.C., the columns and the marble and the steps and the porticos. Those are Greek designs, right? Those are Greek ways of looking. Why would we be building our government buildings, particularly, in the style of the Greeks? Because our traditions of government and civic society and how to be in society go back to the Greeks, right? Via the Romans, they go back to the Greeks. Why do we build? I mean, look at most statues, right? I mean, not the abstract ones, but a lot of statues have this very realistic look to them. They got the sort of contrapposto stance. Your book talks about these things. We are the inheritors of a tradition of Greek sculptural technique that was basically perfected over 2,000 years ago, right? When you look at a figurative statue, a statue of a person, basically, of a figure, that is meant to be realistic rather than abstract, it's not like we've invented some new technique that surpasses Phidias, right? Maybe some materials techniques, but in terms of sculpture, they pretty much had it nailed. We're pretty much just imitating people that were gone 2,400 years ago. That's bonkers when you think about it, right? democracy. We believe in democracy and the rule of the people and the rule of law. Where did those ideas come from? The friggin' Greeks! Almost 2.5 millennia ago. How did they get here? Right? That's like when I go into the kitchen and I find one of my socks. And I'm like, okay, I've got socks. That much is not in dispute, but how did it get into the kitchen? Right? And the answer is almost always one of my 4 horrible cats. But in this case, the answer is Alexander the Great and then Rome. How did Greek ideas from 2,400 years ago get all the way across the ocean? Well, they got everywhere, and then they got into Rome, and Rome brought them to Europe and England, and then we came from England and Europe, and that's how they got here, because of Alexander. If Alexander had never lived, as broken down as Greece was, following the Peloponnesian War and the sequel, the Return of the Empire there, Return of the Empire Strikes Back, as broken down as Greece was at that point in history, if Alexander had never lived and never carried out his conquests, it's entirely plausible to me that Greek culture would have been a weird footnote in history, right? Would the Romans have adopted Greek learning as their standard of education if it hadn't have been the standard of education everywhere else already? I don't know, maybe not. The Romans were very practical people. It wasn't so much that they gave a shit. It wasn't so much that they were fanboys of Greek learning, so much as they were fanboys of being able to talk to literally everyone else in the world. And those people were fanboys of Greek learning. So like, fine, I'll learn this nerd shit so I can talk to you, right? It's like having a significant other that reluctantly participates in your hobbies. I'm not in that position, fortunately. My significant other is enthusiastic about my hobbies, which is nice. But you see what I'm talking about. Alexander's stupidly unsuccessful attempt to build a new empire both clears the path for Rome, because once Rome busts out of Italy, it doesn't find any serious competition, and, which it would have if the Persians had still been around. If the Persians had still been around when Rome busted out of Italy, that would have been that, probably. So Alexander's stupidly failed attempt at empire both clears the way for Rome and spreads a culture that might have otherwise been lost everywhere. And through Rome, ensures that that culture is going to be, well, in many ways, still alive and kicking, 2,400 years later. And here we are. Okay, so that is the Golden Age of Athens and the Hellenistic world, not Hellenic, Hellenistic. The Hellenic world was in Greece, was actually at the center. The Hellenistic world is when Alexander takes Greek culture and smears it everywhere, and everything is just sort of Greeky, and that's Hellenistic. Okay, have fun, have a good day. I've been on this thing for 59 minutes. Not feeling too bad, but let's not push our luck. I am only mortal, and I should have some yogurt. All right, take care, be well, bye.